In the 60s, a new battle against organized crime and corruption was declared, yet the Kennedy administration remained unaware that they were targeting some of America's most powerful figures. These men, hailing from the Prohibition era, led by Luciano Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, Benjamin Siegel, Red Levine, Vito Genovese, Santo Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, Tommy Lucchese, and others, formed a formidable criminal syndicate. As the decade unfolded, the French Corsican Mafia, known for its long history and political prowess, aligned with the Sicilian and Italian-American Mafia, bolstering their strength. This partnership signified the Sicilian Mafia's acknowledgement of American power, as they controlled the most influential nation. Despite perceptions of Sicilian dominance, it was the American Mafia that held sway in the 40s, 50s, and 60s post-World War II. However, by the 80s, the landscape shifted. The old guard, who had held power since the 50s and 60s, began to lose their grip, paving the way for a stronger Sicilian-Italian mafia to emerge. Prohibition marked a pivotal shift in American history, as highlighted in my earlier documentary featuring Frank Costello. By criminalizing alcohol, the government inadvertently transformed small-time bootleggers into wealthy kingpins. Alcohol, a staple in every social class, became the forbidden fruit, driving its demand underground. This created a lucrative opportunity for organized crime figures like Costello and Luciano, who capitalized on the newfound demand. They expanded their operations, utilizing shipping routes and partnerships with leaders in places like Newfoundland and Cuba to smuggle alcohol into the country. This illegal trade burgeoned into a billion-dollar industry, fueling the rise of powerful crime syndicates. However, with the end of Prohibition, the landscape shifted once again. Vito Genovese, recognizing new opportunities, ventured to Italy and orchestrated the heroin trade, cementing his influence in the criminal underworld. The transportation routes once used for smuggling alcohol now facilitated the influx of heroin into America, whether by boat, car, ship, or plane. With the emergence of larger ships and the absence of advanced screening technology, it became increasingly difficult to intercept these illicit goods. Thus, organized crime figures held a firm grip on the flow of narcotics into the country, birthing the era of narco-trafficking. As the 60s unfolded, the aftermath of wars like Vietnam exacerbated the situation. Many returning veterans, grappling with physical and psychological trauma, turned to heroin for relief. This surge in demand, coupled with its use among jazz musicians and as a medicinal aid, fueled the heroin epidemic sweeping through America during the 60s and 70s. The consequences were devastating, with addiction and overdose rates skyrocketing, leaving a profound impact on society. The leaders of this organized syndicate were not just mere criminals, they were influential power brokers, entrenched in unions, wielding control over vast territories across America. From the Cuban Mafia to the French Corsican syndicates, their reach extended far and wide. Some of these groups even funneled weapons into extremist factions, fueling far-right activities aimed at toppling regimes like Castro's in Cuba. Throughout the 60s, amidst escalating tensions with the White House, these figures found themselves in the crosshairs of the Kennedy administration. No longer viewed as mere bootleggers of a bygone era, they were now seen as formidable, heavyweight players in the narco-trafficking underworld. The Five Families of New York, the Chicago Outfit, and the criminal enterprises of Florida and New Orleans, particularly under Carlos Marcello's reign, were at the forefront of this illicit trade. Marcello, a master manipulator with connections reaching from Sicily to Mexico, was a kingpin in the narco-trafficking industry. Utilizing planes as his preferred mode of transportation, he orchestrated the seamless flow of drugs across borders during the tumultuous 1950s and 1960s. And behind the scenes, figures like David Ferrie played a sinister role, perfecting trafficking routes to ensure the uninterrupted flow of narcotics, staining the fabric of American society with their insidious operations. This 1968 article offers valuable insights into the intricate history of organized crime, although it's important to note potential inaccuracies, particularly concerning figures like Charlie Luciano. While Luciano faced accusations related to narcotics and prostitution, subsequent revelations have shed doubt on these claims, highlighting the complexity of his involvement in criminal activities. The article, largely crafted by Norman Lewis, draws extensively from research on the Sicilian Mafia, although some historical details may have been influenced by hearsay rather than concrete evidence available at the time. Over time, corrections were made, especially regarding Luciano's alleged narco-trafficking activities and the exposure of individuals like Tom Dewey. Nevertheless, the article paints a vivid picture of the Sicilian Mafia's influence, both in Italy and America, capturing the enduring legacy of this criminal syndicate. Today, remnants of these networks persist, operating across borders, including in Italy, New York, and Canada, demonstrating the ongoing impact of organized crime on global society. Here is the article in full. These men are or were members of the Mafia. 2 are dead, murdered in the merciless vendettas that occasionally erupt within the organization. The man sprawled in his own blood on a Palermo street is a mute exhibit of the classic punishment meted out to the recalcitrant mafioso. 8 men in this portrait gallery stood trial this year, along with 2 other high-ranking mafiosi accused of operating an international criminal organization in collaboration with the Mafia's American offshoot, Cosa Nostra, whose highly skilled ambassador-at-large, Joseph Cerrito, is the 11th man in our lineup. But almost inevitably, the trial broke down for lack of evidence. The Mafia is now settling back into its old routine on both sides of the Atlantic. We sent Norman Lewis, author of the definitive book on the Mafia, The Honored Society, to the Sicilian capital for this report on the abortive trial, its bizarre background, and its aftermath. Sometime in 1963, American and Italian police forces, assisted by Interpol, began in collaboration what has been claimed as the greatest international crime investigation ever attempted. They had evidence that a major part of the world's supply of illicit heroin was being smuggled in its basic form as raw opium from the Middle East to Sicily, where it was processed in secret laboratories and redirected by underground channels to the United States. The police were convinced that they knew the organizers of this trafficking, all of them Sicilians or Americans of Sicilian origin. Secret agents, therefore, shadowed these men backwards and forwards in their innumerable trips across the Atlantic. Telephones were tapped, correspondence intercepted, hotel rooms bugged, bank accounts investigated, and clandestine meetings secretly photographed. On August 2nd, 1965, newspapers prepared to rush out special editions after news was leaked to them of an impending police operation of great importance. That day, in fact, the Sicilian Squadra Mobile, acting simultaneously in various parts of Italy, arrested 10 imperturbable men who made no protest, nor even showed surprise when the chains were fastened on them, Italian style, before they were led away to prison. It took 5 months for the examining magistrate, Vigneri, to sort through the avalanche of evidence, and his sentence committing all 10 men for trial occupied a record 343 pages. A further 7 men were to be tried in absentia. 3 of the accused had American and Italian dual nationality, and the rest were Sicilians. 6 Americans and 1 Sicilian had escaped to the States and could not be extradited because the crime with which they were charged, association for criminal purposes, is not recognized in U.S. criminal law. The trial itself was delayed for more than 2 years, a delay apologized for by the prosecution as inevitable due to the congestion of the courts, although those sympathetic to the defense murmured about diabolical plots. On March 14, 1968, the trial finally began. This was a gala occasion, Southern style, celebrating the impending triumph of justice, complete with street cordons of granite-faced armed police, stampeding pressmen, and entranced crowds waiting for the arrival of the cortege from the prison, as if it were a religious procession with banners and images. The case was set to make history for 2 outstanding reasons. The first was the awe-inspiring reputation of the men in court. Previous mafia trials had typically involved rank-and-file members, and even these had always resulted in acquittals. The newspapers described these men as the princes of crime. Joe Bananas, Giuseppe Bonanno, one of their number to be tried in absentia, was regarded in the USA as the Al Capone of his day. John Bonventre, caught in the police net, was reputed to be his lieutenant. Even more significant were the high hopes that the trial would uncover the relationship between the mafia and its American offshoot, Cosa Nostra, thereby shedding light on the activities of what has become the most powerful and successful criminal organization the world has ever known. All previous mafia trials had followed a simple pattern of failure, collapsing because witnesses either refused to give evidence or retracted statements made to the police as soon as they were placed in the witness box. This was the rationale behind the charge of association for criminal purposes. A roughly hammered out but, it was hoped, serviceable legal weapon. Apart from the evidence provided by various police agencies, the prosecution planned to rely solely on documents. It was hoped this approach would eliminate the familiar and humiliating spectacle of witnesses who, when brought face to face with the mafia in the dock, lost their nerve, their memory, and even fainted with fright, often choosing to go to jail for perjury rather than collaborate further with the law. The prisoner's appearance was the first surprise. The obsidian features of Edward G. Robinson, and latterly the television gangsters of Danger Man, left one ill-prepared for the ingrained respectability of these calm faces, this modest stillness and humility. All of these men, seen in the flesh, were unrecognizable from their rogues gallery portraits published in the newspapers. The difference was so extraordinary that one wondered if some subjective element could possibly exist, if one were, in fact, the victim of some strange, suggestive power that cloaked ferocity in mildness and replaced the famous cold stare of the mafioso, reported on one well-known occasion to have caused even a bandit to lower his gun, with a kind of twinkling benevolence. 4 men, chained together, sat in the dock. While the television cameras respectfully averted their gaze and each man's left hand was removed from its manacles, the waiting families of neatly dressed, well-behaved children and homely women surged forward to embrace them. Diego Playa closed his eyes to clutch his small granddaughter to him and kiss her a dozen times, then fished in his pocket with his free hand for a packet of sweets. He was the head of the Liberal Party in his native town and had recently been acquitted on a charge of dynamiting the house of a business competitor. At his side, John Bonventre radiated paternalism, looking like a more than usually unworldly priest. His immediate superior, if the story were true, had invented a split-level coffin in which, in the funeral parlor he owned, a man who had not died of natural causes could be accommodated in a compartment below one for whom a regular death certificate was available. Giuseppe Magaddino, thoughtfully removing his dark glasses to be kissed on both cheeks, was chubby and smiling. It was hard to realize that the special qualities the mafia requires, loyalty to one's own kind, obedience, endurance, implacability, silence and self-control, could be concealed in their purest concentration beneath this complacent salesman's exterior. His father, Gaspare, had managed to make his getaway to the States, where reports said he was already making his presence felt by the machine gunning of 3 diners in a Greenwich Village restaurant. This courtroom displays of affection, by the way, was a private family interlude having no official existence. Photography in an Italian court is illegal, as in this country, but it is widely practiced by previous arrangement with the usher, although never during such reunions. There was some natural disappointment that the great Henco Russo, arrested and charged with the others, was too unwell to attend court. Genco Russo had been considered the head of the Sicilian mafia for the past 20 years. A Christian Democrat politician who liked to be photographed arm in arm with cabinet ministers and prominent churchmen, and who had effortlessly brushed off 4 charges of murder. It seems that Genco Russo, perturbed at what he had heard of the American capacity for violence, had taken 10 bodyguards with him to a Mafia Cosa Nostra convention in Palermo, at which Joe Bananas was to be present. Much was made of this at the preliminary hearing. Russo said that he and some friends had been in town to buy a few pigs, and his counsel explained, "My client is a decent living farmer. He has no interests of any kind apart from looking after his farm." Danilo Dolci speaks of the great capo mafia, as Russo sees himself, in his book Waste, although at that time Dolci did not feel able to mention him by name. "I welcome every class of person with open arms," Genco Russo said. "I'm always here. If a person comes and asks me a favor, I will do it for him. I cannot say no to anyone. There's some force outside a man's control that drives him to help his neighbors." In the succession of circumstances leading up to this spectacular occasion in the Palace of Justice, Palermo, there are certain singular events arising out of the Allied occupation of Sicily in the last war. In the 20s, Mussolini's anti-mafia campaign had been successful to the extent that several hundred mafiosi emigrated to the United States, where they continued to flourish in the congenial environment of the Prohibition era. In 1931, a major reorganization of the American offshoot of the Italian mafia was undertaken by two young émigrés, Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese. The newcomers could see that the honored society, as the mafia is referred to by its members, had degenerated into warring gangs that could only eventually exterminate each other in their battles over the division of the loot. Luciano and his lieutenants orchestrated a quick, clean massacre of the greediest contenders, eliminated the greasers of the Al Capone type, and thereafter reinstated the pseudo-military discipline of the old Italian mafia. Each group, as before, was called a family, with a capo at its head, advised by a consigliere, counsellor. Beneath them come the sottocapo, then several capo regime, lieutenants, each controlling a squad of soldati, soldiers. Since the days of the Luciano Genovese reforms, the American mafia has been popularly known as Cosa Nostra, our affair, and currently there are 24 families, each with memberships varying from 20 to 700. To put an end to the mutually destructive gunplay, Luciano and Genovese created a national commission composed of 9 or 10 conciliatory personalities selected from the heads of families. All disputes too significant for the capo to handle had to be referred to this body. The final contribution of this partnership was the invention of the cusinetto, or buffer, whose function is to transmit the capo's orders to the lower echelons with which the chief has no personal contact, and to insulate him from the police. The application of these various devices was a huge success. Organized crime expanded like a superbly managed public company, on a scale and speed never known before, but there was little realization that all this was happening until the revelations made in 1962 by Joseph Valachi, Cosa Nostra's first defector. The less enterprising mafiosi who stayed at home in Sicily kept under and bid their time, managing, despite the last war, to maintain close contact with their friends overseas. Their great opportunity arrived with the projected Allied invasion of Sicily. Shortly before this was launched, Luciano, then serving a 30 to 50-year sentence for compulsory prostitution, appealed to the parole board for a reduction of his sentence in consideration of services rendered to the nation. The appeal was successful, and Luciano was shortly afterwards released. The services consisted of arranging with two old friends, Vizzini, head of the Sicilian mafia, and Genco Russo, his second in command, for the surrender of the western half of Sicily without resistance to the invading American forces. It was clear that the mafia expected and received its quid pro quo, and the mayors appointed by the grateful allies were mafiosi to a man. To ensure that the bargain was carried out to the letter, Amgot, the Allied military government, was accompanied by an unofficial advisor who turned out to be none other than Vito Genovese himself, at that time wanted for murder in the States. Thus, for a short time, the Luciano-Genovese partnership was re-established, although Genovese, returning to the USA shortly after the war, managed by some extreme miscalculation to get himself arrested and has been in jail ever since. The personalities of these two men deserve a passing glance. Vito Genovese lived back home in New Jersey in a 6-room house cluttered with Victorian furniture and dusty plaster saints. He drove an old Ford car and liked to cook for himself. When he entered a room, people usually stood, and any low-level member of the organization who happened to be present might have to be prevented from kneeling to kiss his ring. He was usually referred to not by name, but as a certain person. Luciano, too, was a man with quiet tastes, although he could endure the trappings of power when thrust upon him. When in 1945 he was deported from the US, a cortege of white Cadillacs accompanied him to the pier, and dock workers respectfully cleared the area of the general public. Luciano, who died at Naples airport after swallowing a cup of coffee, whispered to have contained prussic acid, was carried to the grave in the hearse used for Caruso, specially refurbished for the occasion, and drawn by 8 black horses. In Palermo, his memory remains green. In June of this year, a barman in a hotel he used to frequent said of him, "He was possibly the most charming man I have ever met. Kind and considerate to everyone, always with the same lady, and always full of little attention, an exquisite personality." Under the suzerainty of Lucky Luciano and Don Carlo Vizzini, the golden age of the Sicilian mafia began. The honored society had evolved in the Middle Ages as a species of perpetual underground resistance to foreign government and 800 years of feudalism, but in the end it was hardly to be distinguished in its oppressions from the tyrannies it had resisted. The only opponent that had scored any small success had been Mussolini. Now once again it was absolute master in its own house and functioning with the precision of a fine machine as a government within a government, exacting a tribute on everything the country produced, and with its own secret courts that awarded one penalty only, death, promoting a sphere of docility and resignation in the general population. If your wife's bracelet or your car was stolen, you went, not to the police, but to the local man of honor who got the stolen property back promptly, levied a charge, and might even decide to punish the thief. A friend of mine who was recording music in a Sicilian village thought it the most natural thing in the world to ask the village mafioso for his help, and this was freely accorded, with no fee asked. The mafiosi were not too strongly objected to by the Christian Democrat politicians for whom they persuaded people to vote. They were favored by many prominent churchmen as opponents of communism and guardians of traditional morality, and above all, they were courted by the great landowners who employed their services to remove from the scene a whole succession of troublesome trade union leaders. Apart from the methods used by the mafia to extract its percentages and its tolls, and from the numerous violences employed against dissidents, Sicily became the most law-abiding area in Italy. The mafia does not tolerate petty crime within its jurisdiction. These tranquil days came to an end with the brusque repatriation from the US of about 500 Sicilian American undesirables who brought with them new ideas and more expansive attitudes on the subject of organized crime. There was a strange, warped ethos that prohibited the original Sicilian man of honor from dirtying his hands in prostitution or drug trafficking, and it was the mission of the new men to cure their European cousins of these susceptibilities. When, for example, Vizzini, head of the Sicilian mafia, asked Lucky Luciano how he could have allowed himself to get mixed up in such an unpleasant business as prostitution, Luciano excused himself on racial grounds. Foreign women to him were only half human. He couldn't imagine them in the guise of Sicilian wives and mothers. The same principle could be introduced to excuse drug trafficking. There is no case on record of any Sicilian taking drugs. If the half Anglo-Saxons wanted to harm themselves, let them do it. The return of the emigrants was inevitably followed by a period of adjustment and compromise. A few of the repatriates who proved too brash or insistent were traditionally removed by a blast of the Lupara, sawn-off shotgun, and dropped out of sight in one of the many crevices that the limestone formations in the Palermo area provide. But overall, there were valuable lessons to impart, and the huge profits from the drug trade soon provided the bond of reconciliation between the old and new mafias, as they were referred to during that period. There were 3 full-scale conventions in 1957, one in Appalachian, New York, and 2 in Palermo, to put the organization on a sound business footing. Through spies who have penetrated the mafia at very low levels, the police know that heroin has been exported in consignments of canned fish and oranges, but the favored method has been the bag with a false bottom carried by the Sicilian illegal emigrant. This individual's entry into the US has been arranged by the mafia, who meet him as soon as he steps ashore. The profits were fantastic. The product, once finally peddled in 5-grain packs on the streets of New York, fetched up to 1,000 times its original cost price in Palermo. The top mafiosi, richer than ever before, began to invest their surplus millions into legitimate big businesses. Then, in the spring of 1963, one of those unfortunate incidents occurred that highlighted a potential weakness in mafia organization, a weakness that is the nightmare of the cool-headed leaders at the top, who desire only to conduct their operations in peace and without publicity. This was the tragic fate of Cesare Manzella, president of the Catholic Action in a suburb of Palermo, who had spent much of a huge fortune made in the USA on local charities, including the personal endowment of an orphanage. One evening, returning home from a visit to a nunnery, Manzella found it impossible to drive his car into his courtyard because a brand new Alfa Romeo was parked there. He must have been puzzled to see his house guardian sitting in the front seat of the car, apparently asleep. The guardian had been shot through the heart. When Manzella went to investigate, he opened the Alfa Romeo's door, triggering an explosion so violent that it wrecked half of his house. Nothing was found of Manzella but his hat and a single shoe, which were later buried in a sumptuous coffin along with a dummy dressed in one of his suits. A neighborhood wreath read, "He was animated by boundless compassion." However, a satchel containing Manzella's papers was later discovered in the branches of a tree, casting light on certain baffling matters. It became clear that Manzella had become Luciano's successor as the chief organizer for Sicily's drug trafficking operations. Further inquiries revealed the story of a sudden and deadly rift within the local mafia membership. Manzella had recently arranged for an important delivery of heroin to New York, delegating all the operations details to an enthusiastic underling, Calcedonio di Pisa. The package, carried by a crew member on a transatlantic vessel, was found to be underweight by its purchaser upon delivery. A telephone call was made to Manzella, requesting that Di Pisa be put on trial before a properly constituted mafia court, and Manzella had to agree. Mafia trials dispense with a judge and jury, but are democratic in general principle. After hearing the cases for the prosecution and defense, each family member present is given 2 slips of paper, one marked with an M for death, mort, and the other with an N for acquittal, no. The vote is then taken, and the sentence is either carried out immediately or there are handshakes all around. In this instance, the likable and popular Di Pisa was found not guilty. However, a strong faction headed by the brothers La Barbera contested the verdict, and a few days later, Di Pisa was shot dead in the crowded main square of Palermo. No one, of course, admitted to seeing or hearing the shooting. The benevolent Manzella believed that such breaches of discipline could only be remedied by vigorous action. One of the La Barberas disappeared forever, and the second on the run got as far as Milan before he was grievously wounded in an ambush. Manzella's liquidation marked the start of a new trend in the technique of assassination. The Alfa Romeo Giulietta produced that year featured the car battery in its trunk, which greatly facilitated the task of wiring up an explosive charge. Alfa Romeos began exploding all over Palermo, tragically claiming the lives of innocent bystanders, including 2 bakers who, on their way to work, saw a car parked outside a garage with smoke emanating from it and, incredibly enough, crossed the road to investigate. The situation deteriorated to such an extent that the mere sight of this model of car, left unattended for a suspiciously long time, was enough to panic the police into cordoning off the street and evacuating nearby buildings. On the morning of June 30th, 1963, a telephone call was received at police headquarters from Ciaculli, a few miles from Palermo, reporting another suspicious-looking Alfa Romeo abandoned in a lane. Army engineers and a squad of policemen were dispatched and were relieved to find that this was a straightforward job, not requiring the dismantling of wiring for an explosive charge because the bomb, a primitive affair with a fuse, had been left on the back seat. One of the rear tires was flat, and that, quite clearly, was the reason the car had been abandoned. After removing the bomb from the back seat, somebody opened the trunk, triggering the real charge to explode. The bomb on the seat had been a decoy. All 7 soldiers and policemen were killed. From this time onward, the rough and ready methods of Mussolini's anti-mafia campaign were revived. The dictator had dealt with potential enemies of the regime by dispensing with trials altogether and simply exiling suspects to some remote part of the country. There they were deprived of the protection of their own environment and could be kept under police surveillance. In the old days this was called confino, but in more recent times, to avoid raising the spectre of old memories, the system has been renamed soggiorno obbligato, enforced residence, though it is essentially the same practice. Many hundreds of suspected mafiosi were to pay the penalty for the explosion at Ciaculli in this manner, among them the previously invulnerable Genco Russo, who was abruptly picked up and hustled off to northern Italy. 2 years later, he was rearrested to appear in Palermo as one of the 10 defendants in the major drug trial. This Palermo trial, which concluded this summer, was indeed remarkable by British standards. The charge of association for criminal purposes appeared cumbersome and lacking in focus to a foreign observer, and the much-acclaimed collaboration with the US lost impact when Joe Valachi, the convict whose revelations first disclosed the existence of Cosa Nostra, was not allowed to travel to Sicily to testify. Instead, Vigneri, the Italian examining magistrate, flew to the US and took a statement from Valachi in prison. What Valachi had to say about the accused men sounded vague when read out in court. He identified Vincenzo Martinez as a member of Cosa Nostra, but knew only one of the others. He could provide no precise information on narcotics trafficking, stating that he was a very low-level member of the organization. With the deflation of Valachi, the prosecution's case was based on activities that to an outsider were suspected in the extreme, but little more than that. Men with only modest verifiable incomes had been paying huge sums into their bank accounts. They had been seen in the company of notorious Corsican drug smugglers. They had attended meetings at a hotel at a time when the leading personalities of Cosa Nostra had been staying there. In the letters that had passed between them, and in their many overseas phone calls, there was unmistakable furtive and outstanding dignity of presence, who explained that if he had been seen in the company of well-known gangsters, it was only in his secondary capacity as a newspaper editor. Mysterious sums appearing in bank accounts were just as easily dealt with. Franco Coppola accounted for a single pay-in of 240 million lire, £162,000, by saying that he had been lent the sum to build a small port for pleasure vessels, and 2 impeccable financiers were forthcoming to confirm the facts of this loan. John Bonventre could prove that he had bought a plot of land for 1.5 million lire and immediately resold it for 30 million. The innocence of what had appeared at first to be nefarious deals was defended by mountains of whitewashing documentation. So far from being in criminal association, the defendants assured the court they barely knew each other. The prosecution took a bad knock over the cases of mistaken identity when 2 of the men on trial were accused of having issued checks to notorious mafiosi. In both instances, it was shown that the amounts were in fact paid to irreproachable citizens of the same name. Under cross-examination, the accused men's demeanour remained unruffled. John Bonventre, sheltered behind the earthworks of a whimsical smile and apparent good nature, irritated the president with a tendency to moralize. The president, referring to the mafia jargon in one of Bonventre's letters, Nzunza, the term for heroin, and Sofia Vento, meaning the heat's on, asked, "You seem a little worried about something. Perhaps you would tell us why?" Bonventre responded, "I am worried about the times we live in. You cannot pick up a newspaper without reading about such terrible things. As for me, I always say a quiet conscience is any man's dearest possession." The president, showing exasperation, said, "Let's hear less of the philosophy." Rosario Vitality appeared excessively polite. The president asked, Can you explain the mysterious matter of money sent by you to the United States for the defendant Simone? Vitality replied, Certainly, Your Excellency. Simone sold his house before leaving Sicily, and as the purchaser couldn't pay at the time, he asked me to collect the money and send it on. The President queried further, Were you not involved in a shooting affray in Brooklyn in 1937? Vitality explained, Not a shooting affray, Your Excellency. It was New Year's Eve, and people were discharging firearms out of pure joy. I was struck by a stray bullet. I never had an enemy in my life, Your Excellency. The President remarked, Nevertheless, a gangster named Miniscalco happened to be shot dead 50 yards from where you were standing. Vitality responded, By the purest coincidence, Your Excellency. Filippo Gioè Imperiale, alleged to be the owner of a fleet of motor launches used to pick up deliveries from Corsican drug suppliers, claimed he was a poor man and had never owned a boat in his life. The prosecution scored a half point by demonstrating that the supposed Sicilian narcotics fleet was registered in the name of a woman believed to be Gioè Imperiale's mistress, who, fantastically enough, turned out to be on poor relief. Despite the poverty of his lady friend, Gioè Imperiale was alleged to be influential enough to have his own cusinetto or buffer, Franco Garofalo, who had remained in the prison infirmary throughout the trial. A buffer, should the worst come to the worst, accepts responsibility for his superior's misdeeds, and a man of Garofalo's importance in the organization might well have secured himself by employing a buffer of his own. The trial dragged on, punctuated by extraordinary delays. On March 16th, a half hour was dedicated to hearing the evidence of police investigators, followed by a postponement of 14 days. On March 30th, the report of the Guardia di Finanza, which deals with contraband, was read, after which the court adjourned for a month. At the next hearing, 2 American industrialists appeared to testify regarding the respectability of Santo Sorge, not in custody, alleged to be the money mover of the organization. The function of a money mover is to camouflage the origins of illicit gains and purify them through investment in legitimate businesses. The prosecutor had uncovered 2 firms allegedly organized by Sorge that paid large royalties to the US in respect of metallurgical processes that had never been exploited. A week later, when the court reconvened for a few hours, the defense ill-advisedly requested that the U.S. McClellan report on the relationship between the Mafia and Cosa Nostra be admitted into evidence. The prosecution agreed with apparent relish. The report, written in English, consisted of 7 volumes, totaling 1,497 pages. It was initially believed that the document would need to be translated, and the British expert assigned to the task, mentioning he was about to leave on his summer holidays, estimated it would take him a year to complete. For the first time, the morale of the defendants appeared shaken, and many family members were seen in tears. The situation was resolved when a translation from a previous trial was discovered. The evidence provided by John Shanley of the Federal Narcotics Bureau, read at this session, did not seem to strengthen the prosecution's case. Shanley stated, "The heads of the Mafia Cosa Nostra do not engage personally in criminal activities. They confine themselves to a program which is carried out by others." This underscored the peculiar legal scenario wherein the court of Palermo was attempting to try American citizens in absentia, not on the grounds of specific criminal acts, but purely for their association with an American criminal organization. Little remained but to await the verdict. Acquittal was widely anticipated, and indeed, on June 25th, all of the accused men were cleared for lack of proof. However, as was extensively commented upon, the 7 men considered most dangerous had already spent nearly 3 years in prison, which was almost as long as the sentence they would have served had they been found guilty. This situation led to speculation that new tactics were being developed to confront a problem that had become insoluble by old methods. Given this outcome, it is now evident that the Mafia and its American counterpart are interlocking and virtually identical organizations. Thus, it is pertinent to quote certain ominous passages from President Johnson's Task Force report on organized crime, published in 1967. Organized crime affects the lives of millions of Americans, but because it desperately preserves its invisibility, many, perhaps most Americans, are not aware of how they are affected. Organized crime has been expanding despite the nation's best efforts to prevent it. It involves thousands of criminals working within structures as complex as those of any large corporation, subject to laws more rigidly enforced than those of legitimate governments. We are concerned that the demands for illicit goods and services provided by the suave criminals who replace the prohibition, gangsters will eventually dominate commerce as well as government, as it does in Sicily. The new criminal, often with a university education and surrounded by lawyers and economists, is protected from the law by innovative techniques of insulation and even supported morally by his own criterion of honor and code of ethics. He stands on the threshold of invulnerability. He has adapted to the times, whereas the legal systems have been unable to keep pace with the evolution of crime. Organized crime ranks as the third most significant problem facing the United States, trailing only the war in Vietnam and racial antagonisms domestically. At present, there is no foreseeable hope of a solution to this steadily increasing issue. The end.